At the toe of the foothills, Packard brought the convoy to a halt. Had he known who Napoleon Bonaparte was, no doubt he would have felt like that conqueror. Had he known that conqueror's life story, he might have sensed that this was his Waterloo, but Josh Packard lived and died bereft of heroes. He summoned his men from their cars and went amongst them, his mutilated hand tucked in his shirt for support. It was not the most encouraging parade in military history. There were more than a few white and sickly pale faces among his soldiers, more than a few eyes that avoided his stare as he gave his orders. "Men!" he bawled. It occurred to both Cooker and Davidson that as sneak attacks went, this would not be among the quietest. "Men, we've arrived. We're organized, and we've got God on our side. We've got the best of the brutes already, understand?" Silence. Baleful looked more sweat. "I don't want to see one man check of you turn your head and run, because if you do and I set my eyes on you, you'll crawl home with your backside shot to hell." Eleanor thought of applauding, but the speech wasn't over. "And remember, men," here Packard's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, "these devils took Eugene's boy Aaron not 4 hours past. Took him fairly off his mother's tit while she was rocking him to sleep. They ain't nothing but savages, whatever they may look like. They don't give a mind to a mother or a child or nothing. So when you get up close to one, you just think of how you'd felt if you'd been taken from your mother's tit." He liked the phrase mother's tit. It said so much so simply. Mama's tit had a good deal more power to move these men than her apple pie. "You've got nothing to fear but seeming less than men. Good line to finish on. Get on with it." He got back into the car. Someone down the line began to applaud, and the clapping was taken up by the rest of them. Packard's wide, red face was cleft with a hard yellow smile. "Wagons roll," he grinned, and the convoy moved off into the hills. Breaths that warmed him remained as embracing as ever, but there was nevertheless an alteration in the atmosphere, some kind of intrusion. Fascinated, he watched his fathers respond to the change, their substance glinting with new colours, graver, warier colours. One or two even lifted their heads as if to sniff the air. Something was wrong. Someone was coming up to interfere with this night of festival, unplanned and uninvited. The demons knew the signs, and they were not unprepared for the eventuality. Was it not inevitable that the heroes of Welcome would come after the boy? Didn't the men believe, in their pitiable way, that their species was born out of earth's necessity to know itself, nurtured from mammal to mammal until it blossomed as humanity? Natural, then, to treat the fathers as the enemy, to root them out and try and destroy them. Tragedy, really, when the only thought the fathers had was of unity through marriage, that their children should blunder in and spoil the celebration. Still, men would be men. Maybe Aaron would be different. Perhaps he too would go back in time into the human world and forget what he was learning here. The creatures who were his fathers were also men's fathers. And the marriage of semen in Lucy's body was the same mix that had made the first males. Women had always existed. They had lived, a species to themselves, with the demons. But they had wanted playmates, and together they had made men. What an error. What a cataclysmic miscalculation. Within mere eons, the worst rooted out the best. The women were made slaves, the demons killed or driven underground, leaving only a few pockets of survivors to attempt again that first experiment, and make men, like Aaron, who would be wiser to their histories. Only by infiltrating humanity with new male children could the master race be made milder. That chance was slim enough without the interference of more angry children, their fat white fists hot with guns. Aaron scented Packard and his stepfather, and smelling them, knew them to be alien. After tonight they would be known dispassionately, like animals of a different species. It was the gorgeous array of demons around him he felt closest to, and he knew he would protect them, if necessary, with his life. Packard's car led the attack. The wave of vehicles appeared out of the darkness, their sirens blaring, their headlights on, and drove straight towards the knot of celebrants. From one or two of the cars, Terrified cops let out spontaneous howls of terror when the full spectacle came into view, but by that time the attack force was committed. Shots were fired. Aaron felt his father's clothes around him protectively, their flesh now darkening with anger and fear. Packard knew instinctively that these things were capable of fear. He could smell it off them. It was part of his job to recognise fear, to play on it, to use it against the miscreant. He screeched his orders into his microphone and led the cars into the circle of demons. In the back of one of the following cars, Davidson closed his eyes and offered up a prayer to Yahweh, Buddha and Groucho Marx. Grant me power, grant me indifference, grant me a sense of humour. But nothing came to assist him. His bladder still bubbled and his throat still throbbed. Ahead, the shriek of brakes. Davidson opened his eyes just a slit and caught sight of one of the creatures wrapping its purple-black arm around Packard's car and lifting it into the air. One of the back doors flung open and a figure he recognised as Eleanor Cooker fell the few feet to the ground, followed closely by Eugene. Leaderless, the cars were in a frenzy of collisions, the whole scene partially eclipsed by smoke and dust. There was the sound of breaking windscreen as cops took the quick way out of their cars, the shrieks of crumpling hoods and sheared-off doors, the dying howl of a crushed siren, the crying plea of a crushed cop. Packard's voice was clear enough, however. Howling orders from his car even as it was lifted higher into the air, its engine revving, its wheels spinning foolishly in space. The demon was shaking the car as a child might a toy, until the driver's door opened and Jedediah fell to the ground at the creature's skirt of skin. Davidson saw the skirt envelop the broken-backed deputy and appear to suck him into its folds. He could see, too, how Eleanor was standing up to the towering demon as it devoured her son. "Jedediah, come out of there!" she shrieked, and fired shot after shot into his devourer's featureless, cylindrical head. Davidson got out of the car to see better. Across a clutter of crashed vehicles and blood-spattered hoods, he could make the whole scene out more plainly. The demons were sloping away from the battle, leaving this one extraordinary monster to hold the bridgehead. Quietly, Davidson offered up a prayer of thanks to any passing deity. The devils were disappearing. There'd be no pitch battle, no hand-to-tentacle fight. The boy would be simply eaten alive, or whatever they planned, the poor little bastard. Indeed, couldn't he see Aaron from where he stood? Wasn't that his frail form the retreating demons were holding so high, like a trophy? With Eleanor's curses and accusations in their ears, the sheltering cops began to emerge from their hiding places to surround the remaining demon. There was, after all, only one left to face, and it had their Napoleon in its slimy grip. They let off a volley upon volley into its creases and tucks, and against the impartial geometry of its head, but the devil seemed unconcerned. Only when it had shaken Packard's car until the sheriff rattled like a dead frog in a tin can did it lose interest and drop the vehicle. A smell of gasoline filled the air and turned Davidson's stomach. Then a cry, "Heads down!" A grenade? Surely not with so much gasoline on the... Davidson fell to the floor, and sudden silence, in which an injured man could be heard whimpering somewhere in the chaos. Then the dull, earth-rocking thud of the erupting grenade. Somebody said, "Jesus Christ!" with a kind of victory in his voice. Jesus Christ, in the name of, for the glory of. The demon was ablaze. The thin tissue of its gasoline-soaked skin was burning. One of its limbs had been blown off by the blast, another partially destroyed. Thick, colourless blood splashed from the wounds and the stump. There was a smell in the air like burned candy. The creature was clearly in an agony of cremation. Its body reeled and shuddered as the flames licked up to ignite its empty face, and it stumbled away from its tormentors, not sounding its pain. Davidson got a kick out of seeing it burn, like the simple pleasure he had from putting the heel of his boot in the centre of a jellyfish. Favourite summertime occupation of his childhood. In Maine, hot afternoons, spiking men of war. Packard was being dragged out of the wreckage of his car. My God, that man was made of steel. He was standing upright and calling his men to advance on the enemy. Even in his finest hour, a flake of fire dropped from the flowering demon and touched the lake of gasoline Packard was standing in. A moment later, he, the car, and two of his saviours were enveloped in a billowing cloud of white fire. They stood no chance of survival. The flames just washed them away. Davidson could see their dark forms being wasted in the heart of the inferno, wrapped in folds of fire, curling in on themselves as they perished. Almost before Packard's body had hit the ground, Davidson could hear Eugene's voice over the flames. "See what they've done! See what they've done!" The accusation was greeted by feral howls from the cops. "Waste them!" Eugene was screaming. "Waste them!" Lucy could hear the noise of the battle, but she made no attempt to go in the direction of the foothills. Something about the way the moon was suspended in the sky and the smell on the breeze had taken all desire to move out of her. Exhausted and enchanted, she stood in the open desert and watched the sky. When, after an age, she brought her gaze back down to fix on the horizon, she saw two things that were of mild interest. Out of the hills, a dirty smudge of smoke, and the edge of her vision in the gentle night light, a line of creatures hurrying away from the hills. She suddenly began to run. It occurred to her as she ran that her gait was sprightly as a young girl's, and that she had a young girl's motive, that is, she was in pursuit of her lover. In an empty stretch of desert, the convocation of demons simply disappeared from sight. From where Lucy was standing, panting in the middle of nowhere, they seemed to have been swallowed up by the earth. She broke into a run again. Surely she could see her son and his fathers once more before they left forever. Or was she, after all her years of anticipation, to be denied even that? In the lead car Davidson was driving, commandeered to do so by Eugene, who was not at present a man to be argued with. Something about the way he carried his rifle suggested he'd shoot first and ask questions later. His orders to the straggling army that followed him were 2 parts incoherent obscenities to 1 part sense. His eyes gleamed with hysteria. His mouth dribbled a little. He was a wild man, and he terrified Davidson. But it was too late now to turn back. He was in cahoots with the man for this last apocalyptic pursuit. "See, them black-eyed sons of bitches don't have no fucking heads!" Eugene was screaming over the tortured roar of the engine. "Why are you taking this track so slow, boy?" He jabbed the rifle in Davidson's crotch. "Drive, or I'll blow your brains out!" "I don't know which way they've gone," Davidson yelled back at Eugene. "What you mean? Show me." "I can't show you if they've disappeared." Eugene just about appreciated the sense of the response. "Slow down, boy." He waved out of the car window to slow the rest of the army. "Stop the car! Stop the car!" Davidson brought the car to a halt. "And put those fucking headlights out, all of you!" The headlights were quenched. Behind, the rest of the entourage followed suit. A sudden dark, a sudden silence. There was nothing to be seen or heard in any direction. They disappeared. The whole cacophonous tribe of demons had simply vanished into the air, chimerical. The desert vista brightened as their eyes became accustomed to the gleam of the moonlight. Eugene got out of the car, rifle still at the ready, and stared at the sand, willing it to explain. "Fuckers," he said, very softly. Lucy had stopped running. Now she was walking towards the line of cars. It was all over now. They had all been tricked. The disappearing act was a trump card no one could have anticipated. Then she heard Aaron. She couldn't see him, but his voice was as clear as a bell, and like a bell, it summoned. Like a bell, it rang out. "This is a time of festival. Celebrate with us." Eugene heard it too. He smiled. They were near after all. "Hey," the boy's voice said. "Where is he? You see him, Davidson?" Davidson shook his head. Then, Wait, I see a light. Look, straight ahead a while. I see it." With exaggerated caution, Eugene motioned Davidson back into the driver's seat. "Drive, boy, but slowly, and no lights." Davidson nodded. More jellyfish for the spiking, he thought. They were going to get the bastards after all, and wasn't that worth a little risk? The convoy started up again, creeping forward at a snail's pace. Lucy began to run once more. She could see the tiny figure of Aaron now, standing on the lip of a slope that led under the sand. The cars were moving towards it. Seeing them approaching, Aaron stopped his calls and began to walk away back down the slope. There was no need to wait any longer. They were following for certain. His naked feet made scarcely a mark in the soft sanded incline that led away from the idiocies of the world. In the shadows of the earth, at the end of that slope, fluttering and smiling at him, he could see his family. "He's going in," said Davidson. "Then follow the little bastard," said Eugene. "Maybe the kid doesn't know what he's doing, and get some light on him." The headlights illuminated Aaron. His clothes were in tatters, and his body was slumped with exhaustion as he walked. A few yards off to the right of the slope, Lucy watched as the lead car drove over the lip of the earth and followed the boy down into... "No," she said to herself. "Don't." Davidson was suddenly scared. He began to slow the car. "Get on with it, boy." Eugene jabbed the rifle into his crotch again. "We got them cornered. We got a whole nest of them here. The boy's leading us right to them." The cars were all on the slope now, following the leader, their wheels slipping in the sand. Aaron turned. Behind him, illuminated only by the phosphorescence of their own matter, the demons stood, a mass of impossible geometries. All the attributes of Lucifer were spread among the bodies of the fathers, the extraordinary anatomies, the dreaming spires of heads, the scales, the skirts, the claws, the clippers. Eugene brought the convoy to a halt, got out of the car, began to walk towards Aaron. "Thank you, boy," he said. "Come here. We'll look after you now. We've got them. You're safe." Aaron stared at his father, uncomprehending. The army was disgorging from the cars behind Eugene, readying their weapons. A bazooka was being hurriedly assembled, a cocking of rifles, a weighing up of grenades. "Come to Papa, boy," Eugene coaxed. Aaron didn't move, so Eugene followed him a few yards deeper into the ground. Davidson was out of the car now, shaking from head to foot. "Maybe you should put down the rifle. Maybe he's scared," he suggested. Eugene grunted and let the muzzle of the rifle drop a few inches. "You're safe," said Davidson. "It's all right." "Walk towards us, boy. Slowly." Aaron's face began to flush. Even in the deceptive light of the headlamps, it was clearly changing colour. His cheeks were blowing up like balloons, and the skin on his forehead was wriggling as though his flesh was full of maggots. His head seemed to liquefy, to become a soup of shapes, shifting and blossoming like a cloud, the facade of boyhood broken as the father inside the son showed its vast and unimaginable face. Even as Aaron became his father's son, the slope began to soften. David felt it at first. A slight shift in the texture of the sand, as though an order had passed through it, subtle but all pervasive. Eugene could only gape as Aaron's transformation continued, his entire body now overtaken by the tremors of change. His belly had become distended, and a harvest of cones budded from it, which even now flowered into dozens of coiled legs. The change was marvellous in its complexity, as out of the cradle of the boy's substance came new glories. Without warning, Eugene raised his rifle and fired at his son. The bullet struck the boy demon in the middle of his face. Aaron fell back, his transformation still taking its course, even as his blood, a stream part scarlet, part silver, ran from his wound and into the liquefying earth. The geometries in the darkness moved out of hiding to help the child. The intricacies of their forms were simplified in the glare of the headlamps, but they seemed, even as they appeared, to be changing again, the bodies becoming thin in their grief, a whine of mourning like a solid wall of sound from their hearts. Eugene raised his rifle a second time, whooping at his victory. He had them! My God, he had them! Dirty, stinking, faceless fuckers. But the mud beneath his feet was like warm treacle as it rose around his shins, and when he fired he lost balance. He yelled for assistance, but Davidson was already staggering back up the slope out of the gully, fighting a losing battle against the rising mire. The rest of the army were similarly trapped, as the desert liquefied beneath them and a gluttonous mud began to creep up the slope. The demons had gone, retreated into the dark, their lament sunk away. Eugene, flat on his back in the sinking sand, fired off two useless, vehement shots into the darkness beyond Aaron's corpse. He was kicking like a hog with its throat cut, and with every kick his body sunk deeper. As his face disappeared beneath the mud, he just glimpsed Lucy, standing at the edge of the slope, staring down towards Aaron's body. Then the mire covered his face and blotted him out. The desert was upon them with lightning speed. One or two of the cars were already entirely submerged, and the tide of sand climbing the slope was relentlessly catching up with the escapees. Feeble cries for assistance ended with choking silences as mouths were filled with desert. Somebody was shooting at the ground in a hysterical attempt to dam the flow, but it reached up swiftly to snatch every last one of them. Even Eleanor Cooker wasn't to be let free. She struggled, cursing and pressing the thrashing body of a cop deeper into the sand in her frantic attempt to step out of the gully. There were universal howls now, as panicking men groped and grasped at each other for support, desperately trying to keep their heads afloat in a sea of sand. Davidson was buried up to his waist. The ground that eddied around his lower half was hot and curiously inviting. The intimacy of its pressure had given him an erection. A few yards behind him, a cop was screaming blue murder as the desert ate him up. Further still from him, he could see a face peering out of the seething ground like a living mask thrown on the earth. There was an arm close by, still waving as it sank. A pair of fat buttocks was poking up from the silt sea like two watermelons. A policeman's farewell. Lucy took one step backwards as the mud slightly overran the lip of the gully, but it didn't reach her feet, nor, curiously, did it dissipate itself as the water wave might have done. Like concrete, it hardened, fixing its living trophies like flies in amber. From the lips of every face that still took air came a fresh cry of terror as they felt the desert floors stiffen around their struggling limbs. Davidson saw Eleanor Cooker, buried to breast level. Tears were pouring down her cheeks. She was sobbing like a little girl. He scarcely thought of himself, of the East, of Barbara, of the children. He thought not at all. The men whose faces were buried but whose limbs or parts of bodies still broke the surface were dead of asphyxiation by now. Only Eleanor Cooker, Davidson, and two other men survived. One was locked in the earth up to his chin. Eleanor was buried so that her breast sat on the ground. Her arms were free to beat uselessly at the ground that held her fast. Davidson himself was held from his hips down, and most horribly one pathetic victim was seen only by his nose and mouth. His head was tipped back into the ground, blinded by rock. Still he breathed. Still he screamed. Eleanor Cooker was scrabbling at the ground with torn nails, but this was not loose sand. It was immovable. "Get help!" she demanded of Lucy, hands bleeding. The two women stared at each other. "Jesus God!" screamed the mouth. The head was silent. By its glazed look, it was apparent that he'd lost his mind. "Please help us," pleaded Davidson's torso. "Fetch help!" Lucy nodded. "Go!" demanded Eleanor Cooker. "Go!" Numbly, Lucy obeyed. Already there was a glimmer of dawn in the east. The air would soon be blistering. In welcome, 3 hours' walk away, she would find only men, hysterical women and children. She would have to summon help from perhaps 50 miles distance, even assuming she found her way back, even assuming she didn't collapse exhausted to the sand and die. It would be noon before she could fetch help to the woman, to the torso, the head, the mouth. By that time, the wilderness would have had the best of them. The sun would have boiled their brain pans dry. Snakes would have nested in their hair. The buzzards would have hooked out their helpless eyes. She glanced round once more at their trivial forms, dwarfed by the bloody sweep of the sky. Little dots and commas of human pain on a blank sheet of sand. She didn't care to think of the pen that wrote them there. That was for tomorrow. After a while, she began to run.